Hi, everyone. Hey, thanks for coming. Hope you had a well-deserved rest over fall break, and we're excited to welcome you back to campus with this week's BIOMES seminar. Today, we'll have Ben Blom, an alumnus of the Yale School of Environment, who will be giving a talk about his work on the redwood forests. In case this is your first BIOMES, over the last 15 years, the Yale School of Environment has held this weekly seminar series, which we named BIOMES, and has been the school's flagship forum for bringing cutting-edge research and impactful work to the community. BIOMES stands for Bridging Issues and Optimizing Methods in Environmental Studies. In this vein, I'm excited to introduce Ben Blom, the Director of Stewardship and Restoration at the Save the Redwoods League. Ben holds a Master of Forestry from YSE and has more than 50 years of experience in restoration and forest management. Prior to joining the Save the Redwoods League, Ben worked for the Bureau of Land Management for 12 years, where he oversaw restoration and management operations across 300,000 acres of public land in 10 Central California counties. He now leads the Save the Redwoods League's large-scale projects designed to rehabilitate California's iconic coast redwood and giant sequoia forests. He also oversees the care and management of all Save the Redwoods League's lands and their portfolio of conservation easements. Welcome back to YSE, Ben. Please join me in welcoming Ben Blom to the stage.
All right. Thank you, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's been 15 years since I've been to New Haven, since I graduated. This is my first time back. Yeah, all right. Do you guys still do a Halloween party? Is that still a thing? Or yeah, sweet. Okay, good. Some things don't change. That's good. When I first started going here, this was under construction. So all of our classes were in Marsh or Sage next door. And yeah, my second year this opened, this was like the brand new building on campus. It was really exciting. And of course, we were playing soccer on the field out here, and now that's gone. So anyways, it's always interesting to see what changes and what doesn't. But really excited to be here. This opportunity to come speak kind of came up as a result of the Society of American Foresters Conference, which is happening this week up in Hartford. So I reached out to Mark Ashton and said, hey, I'd love to come to campus. And anyways, this all came together. So I'm really honored to be invited to speak to you all today. I live in Aptos, California, so all the way in Santa Cruz County in California. So some California folks, all right? Yeah, all right, cool. Well, I'm going to be talking about the work. I'll talk a little bit about kind of my story and how I got to where I'm at. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do for Save the Redwoods League. So yeah, here's a little bit of the overview. So I'll tell you a little bit about my story. And then the mission of the organization that I work for, Save the Redwoods League. And then some of the big restoration initiatives that I lead as part of that work. And a lot of the work that I do, I put in the bucket of restoration forestry. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means to me and why I think it's important, and some takeaways kind of towards the end of the talk. So I grew up in New England in the Boston area, suburb of Boston. I went to school at Colgate, and I always loved science. But I didn't know you could do science in the outdoors. It wasn't a thing that really came up in my life until I was like a senior in college at Colgate. And I loved being outside and loved science, and kind of made that connection really late in school. And so it was too late for me to switch majors. And I don't even think they had an ecology major or anything there. So I finished school, and then before I was supposed to go to medical school, because that was the thing you did if you did science, in my mind. And instead, I kind of traveled around, kind of bummed around in different places. I ended up in New Mexico, right on the border near Juarez, Mexico, and then ended up in Mendocino, California. And does anybody know where that is? Yeah, some folks. Okay, so kind of far northern California. I'd never been to California before. And I had this image of California in my mind of what it would be like. And I'd found this job just online. And it was for a logging company. And for some reason, they hired me. I have no idea why, but they hired me to basically go around hooting for owls and looking for spotted owls. And then we would protect their habitat from logging operations. So, my first time in California, my first time being in the Redwoods, it was pretty eye-opening. And through that, kind of like really understood what forestry was. I didn't even know what forestry was, really. I later learned that I have a family history of forestry, which my grandmother told me about, that my great-grandfather was a forester for the Tsar in Russia. So she said, oh, well, he moved to the United States and became like a hat salesman or something. But I have this kind of interesting connection to forestry. And so I was in Mendocino, realized I wanted to do forestry, but I had no schooling in it. And so started looking at schools. And I heard about Yale. I had no conception of that Yale even had a forestry school, of course. But made a connection there and got in. And arrived here in 2008. And for folks that, weren't around or were young back then, that was, the year Obama got elected, the recession happened. So there was a lot going on. I remember being in the hall over there when the election night, that was pretty exciting. Wow, things have changed, huh? But my advisor when I was here was Lisa Curran. She was a professor that then went to Stanford, and she taught a kind of a seminar my first year that was all about Indonesia. And this was kind of this amazing thing. I was like, wow, Indonesia, and it was all about Borneo. And so I studied Indonesian and went to Borneo and went into a place called East Kalimantan on the Indonesian side of Borneo and did a project there. It was supposed to be like a forestry type project, but there's like hundreds of species of trees per acre. And there's no way I was going to do this project. So it quickly morphed out in the field to be more of an anthropology project about some of the conservation work that people were talking about wanting to start in Borneo. And it was all around the time that cap and trade was kind of being talked about in DC. There was going to be this huge new cap and trade program. All this money was going to flow to reduced emissions from deforestation projects. And a lot of that money was going to flow to Borneo because of how much carbon there was in the forest there. And so I went out into these villages, had to take boats up to get to these villages and use my rudimentary Indonesian to interview people about what they thought about this. What did they know about what climate change was or how it impacted their lives, and how trade-offs between deforestation and their livelihoods in the forest, how they were weighing those trade-offs. And it was super complicated. And what I realized is that a lot of the environmental groups that were talking about these projects had never been to visit these villages or talk to people about how they saw this impacting their lives, or the risks that would come if money started flowing into these communities, where there was all sorts of disagreements about what should happen in the future. So I came back after that first summer and realized I don't know that I wanted to work internationally anymore. I really decided I wanted to spend more time domestically. And of course, the economy collapsed my second year here. And there was the stimulus bill. And so there were a lot of government jobs. And so I got into the Presidential Management Fellows Program, which is kind of a way to fast track into federal jobs. And I ended up getting a job for the Bureau of Land Management. And I didn't really know much about BLM. I knew that you could go out. When I lived in New Mexico, I went out sometimes and camped, or I knew you could do whatever you wanted on BLM land and that it was kind of cool. There was a lot of grazing and a lot of mining and stuff. But it was kind of eye-opening. So I moved to Grand Junction, Colorado, and I did land use planning. It was a new conservation area that was created. And so I was working with ranchers, tribes, all sorts of different stakeholders to try to develop a management plan for this specific area. And I did that for several years, developed the plan, and then moved to back to the Redwoods, where I knew I wanted to go back to. So I ended up in Arcata, in Humboldt County. Folks know Humboldt County? All right, yeah, this is the California folks over here, all right. And I managed a place called Headwaters Forest Reserve, which is an old growth redwood reserve up in Humboldt County. And I did that for 4 or 5 years, and then moved down to the central coast of California and was the field manager for the Central Coast field office. So overseeing several 100,000 acres across about 10 counties from the Bay Area down to the south towards San Luis Obispo County. And then in 2022, so my former mentor when I was at the school forest here, Richard Campbell, was in the position that I was in before. So he was a graduate of this school. He was the manager of the school forest. And I'd always been in touch with him. And I was working with Save the Redwoods League when I was managing Headwaters. They were giving us some grants. And so Richard, during the COVID pandemic, decided to move back to New England. And that opened this opportunity for me to come to Save the Redwoods League. It was always kind of a dream job. I mean, I'm a forester. I get to work in the tallest and biggest trees in the world. I mean, it's like kind of a pinnacle job. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I do now. So Save the Redwoods League is a nonprofit. It's been around for over 100 years. And it's really focused around 3 main mission areas, all around redwoods. And when we talk about redwoods, we talk about both species, coast redwood and giant sequoia. And the mission of the organization is to protect, restore, and connect people to these incredible forests. It's hard to kind of get a sense of scale, but that's a spotted owl in the giant sequoia right there. These are massive trees. I get to work in some of the most beautiful places in the world. And so the part of my job is really that restore part. And as far as the Save the Redwoods League goes, the first 100 years of the organization was really about protection. So acquiring lands, protecting them from logging. That was kind of what the organization did and was very successful at that. They protected over 250,000 acres of land. A lot of the state parks that we have in the Coast Redwood Forest in California were protected by Save the Redwoods League. And they were so successful that they basically ran out of old growth redwood to buy. And so there was this transition that happened, recognizing that they were acquiring lands now that had been logged, either destructively or more recently and maybe less destructively, but that there was going to be this emphasis on stewardship into the future. And so like a lot of organizations, they have kind of gone through this kind of transformation from thinking about protection as being kind of drawing a box around an area and putting a gate around it to recognizing that stewardship is an ongoing commitment and that restoration is an important part of that. And so since I started just 4 years ago, I've really grown the program in a lot of ways, tripled the size of the group, our budget, doing a lot more on the ground work, and that's been really exciting to do. So this is the geography of where I get to work. So I live in Santa Cruz County, which is just right in here. The shaded red is the historic range of Coast Redwood. Giant sequoias are on the eastern side of the Central Valley on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, kind of isolated in 80 to 100, depending on whether you're a lumper or splitter, groves that kind of line the western slope here. Coast redwoods grow basically all the way down from Big Sur and Monterey County all the way up to the Oregon border and just spill over into Oregon just a little bit. They're very different species, even though they're both redwoods. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm going to do kind of a deeper dive into kind of the stand dynamics, kind of silviculture talk tomorrow if anybody wants to come to the forest dynamics lecture in Marlise's class. So this is the geography that I work in. So I drive a lot. It takes about 7 hours to drive up here, about 6 hours to drive over here for me. But I'm on the road a lot, and we have teams of folks that are centered in both places. So this is a kind of an old growth, iconic Coast Redwood forest. This is kind of what it looks like. You can kind of feel what it feels like to be in one of these forests. How many folks have been in a Coast Redwood forest before? Okay. So these are the tallest trees in the world, over 380 feet tall. The forests are really unique in a lot of ways. So one thing that you'll notice about this forest is it's not uniform. So they're not adapted to kind of even age disturbances like you'd see in some species. So it's a lot of small gap dynamics, as like Mark Ashton talks about. You'll see clumps of redwoods, then big gaps. And these trees grow for thousands of years. And so these big gaps are really important for them to be as big as they are. They're incredibly diverse in the understory. So those big gaps in the forest create these openings that bring in a lot of flowering plants, that bring in wildlife. There's multi-layered canopies. So you see these big kind of iconic dominant trees that stick through the canopy, but there's lots of different tiers of the canopy. And then there's whole ecosystems that exist in the canopies of these trees. So there's entire soil profiles in these trees, the plants that specifically thrive within those soil types up in the canopies of these trees. They're also adapted to year-round moisture. So California has a Mediterranean climate, which means it rains in the winter, dry in the summer. Coast redwoods are adapted, and they have specialized needles in their canopies that are adapted to capture water from marine fog. So they capture water even in the summer, in the driest part of the year. And they're incredibly wet places. So some of these places in coast redwood forest get up to 100 inches of rain a year, kind of on the temperate rainforest side of the range. But they're adapted to that really seasonality of that rainfall. Giant sequoias, on the other hand, are a very different species. So they exist in the Sierra Nevada. They're adapted to cold and winter moisture in the form of snow. They are also kind of grow in a clumpy pattern. And these are the biggest trees by volume in the world. And so General Sherman is the largest tree by volume in the world. It's in Sequoia National Park. They also are some of the oldest trees in the world. So some of the older giant sequoias can live over 3,000 years old. And they're incredibly dependent and adapted to fire. The Sierra Nevada gets frequent lightning storms, and native people for thousands of years have been managing these places with fire. All of this green that you see here is giant sequoia seedlings that came in after a fire. This is a grove on the Native American reservation, the Tule River Reservation, where they've been managing consistently with fire for thousands of years. And so you can see kind of what a forest structure looks like in a healthy ecosystem there. You can see the big burn scars on these trees. These trees have incredibly thick bark that prevents them from dying in wildfires. The other thing that's really unique about these forests is their carbon density. So coast redwoods are the most, we call it, say, the heaviest forest in the world. So the above ground biomass in a coast redwood forest exceeds any other forest in the world. Of course, you think about peat forests, there's underground carbon. We try to ignore that because we want to be the heaviest. But over 4,000 megagrams of biomass per hectare in coast redwood forests. And the second most is giant sequoias, but it's not even really that close. So both of these forests are the densest carbon forests in the world, more than the Amazon, more than the Congo, more than Southeast Asia. So incredible carbon potential. The other thing about these forests is that the carbon that they store is not just about the quantity of carbon that they store, it's also the quality. So a lot of this carbon is stored in this heartwood part of the wood. And this is incredibly resistant and resilient to fire and insects and pathogens. It can sit on the forest floor for 1,000 years and doesn't really rot. And that same trait is what made it such a valuable wood. And so as these trees grow older, kind of building heartwood takes a lot of energy. And so it takes a lot of sunlight to produce heartwood. But this is really the kind of the secret sauce, the secret power that redwoods have in terms of their endurance, is their ability to form this heartwood and do it in such dense ways. So as they grow older, the proportion also of their carbon that's in heartwood, this red bar here, goes up. So as they get older, they put more of their energy into producing this heartwood, which is incredibly durable. There's also a lot of species that depend on redwood forests. These are some of the cuter ones. Some of these species are really heavily dependent on mature coast redwood and giant sequoia forests, and are incredibly rare now because of the impacts that I'll talk about in a minute. Oh, let me see. All right. So there are kind of three main project areas that I focus on in my work. I'm really just going to talk about two of them. One is Redwoods Rising way up on the north coast here near Oregon, and Redwood National and State Parks. And then our work in the Giant Sequoia Range through the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition. We also have a large body of work in the Santa Cruz Mountains near where I live. But I just don't have time to talk about that. All the work that we do is really in partnership, and we couldn't do it without those partnerships. So Redwoods Rising. So this is our kind of flagship, biggest restoration initiative. It's one of the biggest restoration projects in the world. It's really focused around Redwood National and State Parks. So how many folks have been to Redwood National Park or up there? Okay. So biggest trees in the world, tallest trees in the world. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Area. But 2/3 of the park was actually logged before it became part of the park. And so a lot of these forests are incredibly unhealthy. Since these places, so some of this park was actually created by eminent domain under the Carter administration. Could you imagine a president doing that now? But they actually took the land from logging companies as they were logging it. And some of that logging was some of the most destructive logging that I've ever seen in my life. It was before the forest practice rules in California. And so there really not a lot of regulation around how logging could be done. And in order to get these massive trees out, they basically buried creeks and put roads to each redwood, felled them into the creek, left those buried streams there, and left kind of devastation all over the place. They were working 24 hours a day to get logs out before the park was created. And so, this is kind of a look of what that looked like. The density of roads that they used to log these areas was incredible. So 670 miles of logging roads were put in, and in salmon habitat watersheds. None of this could happen now in California because of the forest practice rules, but this was before the forest practice rules. And so you can imagine what happens when it rains 100 inches a year. All of this sediment comes down into the creeks, further buries the creeks. We've lost incredible amounts of salmon habitat as a result of this. So Redwoods Rising is really kind of the first attempt to really scale up work to address this problem on a landscape scale. The goals of the project are really to kind of rebuild a forest that's been lost. The forest that came back after those initial logging practices were done is completely different, almost unrecognizable from those coast redwood forests that I showed you before. But really the focus of it, and the reason that we're focused in this area in particular, is that these areas that were logged within the park are kind of basically the matrix habitat surrounded by some of the biggest old growth forests that remain. And so the connectivity there is incredibly important. The work that we do in these second growth forests is also important to protect the health of the old growth next door. It's also really important from a socioeconomic perspective. And I'll talk about that as well. So the main activities that we do as part of this project is basically thinning. So forest restoration, it's commercial thinning that we do. So we're actually logging in Redwood National and State Parks. And all of that revenue that we get from the logging goes back into the project and pays for the parts of the project that we can't fundraise for or can't raise through public grants. And by opening up these forests, we're improving the health of the forests, improving habitat for all those species that depend on more mature forests. And then removing roads. And this is the most expensive part of the work that we do. And there's no revenue from this. So a lot of the funding that we get from the sales of wood go back into this part of the project here. And this is kind of a look of what, this is a very typical crossing. This is actually a better one where they actually put a pipe in. In some cases, they just built something called a Humboldt crossing, where they would just push dirt and wood into a creek and let water kind of flow through the pores that formed as a result. And those blow out and then degrade habitat and kind of looks like this. This is just incredible. This is just basically fill here that's come down from old logging roads. The two areas that we work in Redwoods Rising are also two of the best watersheds for coho salmon, which is really endangered fish species in this part of the coast and incredibly important from a cultural perspective to our tribal partners. And so, once we clean up a riparian area like this, we're trying to rebuild habitat for those species. And in some cases, when you unbury these streams, literally within a year, we have fish spawning again. So it's really a kind of a magical thing. The work that we do on this project is incredibly expensive, and we use a whole range of different funding sources to pay for it. And the public-private partnership that this project really represents is really the only way you'd be able to fund something like this. And so us as the nonprofit partner working with state parks and national parks, we're able to do a lot financially that the agencies can't. We're able to hold, for example, biomass revenue and filter that back into the project. We're able to apply for federal grants and try to get philanthropy to pay for these things, and then cycle that back into the project and be more flexible with contracting. Since I spent 12 years working for the federal government, I understand how difficult it is to get things done and how important it is to have partnerships to make that stuff happen. So this is a little bit about what we've been able to get done. So we've had about 5 years of implementation, and we've completed close to 5,000 acres of forest restoration. We've recovered about 5 miles of fish habitat and removed 85 miles of road. So, in the grand scheme of those big numbers that you saw before, it still feels like we're inching away, but the pace and scale that we've been able to get up to is really hard fought. And each one of those acres, each one of those miles is really difficult. So we're kind of working at a pace now to try to get up to about 1,000 acres per year and about 10 miles of road removed. And we're getting there. And we have funding basically through 2029 that should keep us on this trajectory that you see here. The other part of what we do, like I said, is really socioeconomic. So this is a part of California that's depressed economically. Logging and fishing were kind of the mainstays of the economy, and then more recently cannabis. The cannabis industry has collapsed as a result of legalization. And so these communities are really struggling economically. So we do a lot to try to support kind of a growing workforce. We call it our restoration economy around the work that we're doing up there, trying to break it out of that boom bust cycle that this region's kind of known for. One of the ways we do that is through this apprenticeship program. We brought over 100 students through that program where they learn forestry, watershed restoration, roads management, botany, all of these different programs. And it's a partnership with some of the one of the junior colleges or community colleges up there, as well as Cal Poly Humboldt. And we most recently expanded that program into the Central Valley. There's a couple forestry programs in the Central Valley of California, which is not known for trees. But these programs are incredibly important feeder programs to some of the four-year schools with an incredibly diverse group of students that are going through those programs. So we continue to grow the apprenticeship program. And then the restoration economy is also about the jobs that we're creating in the woods. And so a lot of the folks we work with are from the logging industry. So some of the folks that built these roads, their kids are now pulling the roads out and doing good green jobs. And a lot of them really love the work that we do. But it's very technologically advanced work. We use a lot of newer logging technologies to reduce the impact on the ground. We're using cut-to-length machines that came from Finland, and we're trying to do different things. It's expensive work, and it also requires incredibly knowledgeable and skilled folks to do it. And so we have about over 200 jobs annually that we're creating through this specific project. And for a lot of folks in these kind of economically disadvantaged areas, it's incredibly important. The work that we do, we try to keep it as year-round as we can and allow folks to work year-round. That's incredibly important for people, not just for their income, but also just for the stability of their lives. And so we try to model kind of what we would like that restoration economy to be and how we contract and how we partner with these contractors long-term, create that economic stability that these these regions really need. And more recently, we've been studying some of the impacts. Now that we're about 5 years in, we're looking at the impacts of what we're doing in a more focused way. So this is kind of a typical 30 to 40-year-old forest after a clear cut. And then this is an old growth forest with the highest density of carbon in the world. And how do you get from there to there? It's really an interesting puzzle that we're all working through, kind of through an adaptive management framework. But if you look specifically at the carbon part of this work, here's that maximum old growth all the way up here, densest carbon of any forest in the world. Here's kind of more of an average old growth forest. And here's where we are, about 300 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And so how do you get from there to there? And does thinning get you there faster? And what we've been able to find, this is kind of a simplified graph from a paper that we're still working on. But what we find is that we thin this forest at year 0 here. Within less than 10 years, we're back to the same amount of carbon we had before we thinned, which is kind of amazing. So these trees are incredibly resilient. When you open up light, they do something called epicormic sprouting all up and down the bole of the tree. And within 6 to 9 years, you're back to the amount of carbon you had before you thinned and removed about 20%. But that forest is also healthier and less susceptible to wildfire and pests and other disturbances. By about 22 to 23 years, you've already surpassed the unthinned stand. So that unthinned stand has a lot more trees per acre. So you would assume that it would take a long time for a thin stand to get back there, but it takes about 20 years, which is incredibly fast compared to other systems. So that's kind of the Redwoods Rising part of my talk. I'm going to be talking about this project at Society of American Foresters on Saturday, if anybody is going to be there and wants to come hear more detail about it. But also wanted to build a little bit of time for our work in the Giant Sequoia Lands Coalition. So this is the other big project that we have going on. And this is another partnership with a lot more partners involved. So basically, we call it the GSLC. All of these logos here are basically all of the people that manage giant sequoias. So giant sequoias are this iconic species, but they're really limited in the geographic scope of where they grow. They only grow in these kind of 80 to 100 groves that total about 26,000 acres. So it's a really small geographic area. These groves are kind of relics of a larger range that existed before some of our more recent ice ages. And now they're kind of confined to these pockets where they have the right climatic conditions for them to grow and thrive. And so the story of the giant sequoia in the last 10 years is kind of a sad one. We've had really an existential crisis for this species. So we think about giant sequoias as this iconic species that when you go into a giant sequoia forest, it's like nothing you've ever felt in your life. These massive trees, these incredible forests. But we've lost about 20% of all of our old growth giant sequoias just in the last 10 years. This is a graph that shows fire frequency with acres in the y-axis. So really, there's one main cause for why this has happened. And we like to point to climate change and talk about how climate change is a factor, and it is. But I would say 75% of the cause of this crisis is really mismanagement. When you miss this many fires, so giant sequoias basically are adapted to fire on a 5 to 10 year fire regime. When you miss this many fires, your forest changes dramatically. And we as people have very short timelines. So we think about things, what a forest looked like when we were kids. But I was a kid in the 80s, so if I had grown up around giant sequoias, I would have already thought this is what a giant sequoia forest looked like in the mid 80s. And it was completely out of whack already. And so what we saw is that this eventually catches up to you. And starting in about 2015, we saw the first fires that could actually kill giant sequoias. We once thought that giant sequoias were basically impervious to fire and couldn't be killed by fire because they were adapted to fire, right? But we found that if you kind of create this human experiment of removing something essential from an ecosystem, that relationship between fire and giant sequoias can shift. And if all of that fire that happened starting in 2015 had been good fire, we wouldn't be having a problem right now. But this is a graph that shows the different severities of fire. So the blue is high severity. And those are fires that giant sequoias really aren't adapted to. They're adapted to mixed severity fires with small patches of high severity fire. And that's how they kind of reseed another cohort of giant sequoias. But when you start seeing 20% on up here, the castle fire, of your fire at high severity, these trees are not adapted to that. And so really the two main fire seasons where we lost most of that 20% was in 2020 and 2021. And what comes in the heels of that, in some cases, is entire conversion of vegetation types. So about a third of the Southern Sierra has actually converted from forest to shrubland just in the last 10 years. So we're seeing this happening, this huge landscape scale shifts of vegetation in the Southern Sierra where giant sequoias are. All of this work really coincided with a major drought in California. So we had basically in this time period here, we had a 1,000-year drought in California. 100 years of fire suppression, a 1,000-year drought, hotter and warmer climate, and this is what you end up with. This is a giant sequoia grove, one of the worst groves where there's only 3 living giant sequoias left in the grove. This is a monarch surrounded by those smaller shade-tolerant trees that came in as a result of fire suppression. And so, giant sequoias are adapted to kind of low to moderate severity fire that runs along the ground. And when you have these ladder fuels forming as a result of fire suppression, fire gets up into the crown and it can fully incinerate their cones to the point where they can't regenerate. This is really a process of densification. So this is just an example, but this is a forest in 1914. You read the old early accounts of people that came into these forests and the way that natives managed them for thousands of years. You could ride a horse through your forest without getting off, hundreds of miles. They talked about being able to ride a horse from Bakersfield to Sacramento in the complete shade of these massive oak groves without getting a sunburn. It was a completely different system managed with fire. Within 100 years, we start seeing forests that look more like this. This is actually a grove that burned this summer, McKinley Grove. And I was in there just in June because it was actually our most vulnerable grove. And then it burned this summer. This is kind of what the forest structure looks like in McKinley Grove. These are just some stats: basal area, trees per hectare, canopy cover. Again, when you talk to our native partners that we work with, they tell you our range, we should be going down to 25% canopy cover. 20 to 30% is what they think we should be doing. And they're right, because these forests that are at a higher canopy cover, which we do in the name sometimes of endangered species protection, are not the forests that are adapted to the kind of fire that we have now. And so kind of out of the ashes of all of these catastrophic wildfires, this coalition was formed. And it's really centered around trying to protect what's left of these giant sequoias and make sure that they can exist for another thousands of years in the future. And so all of these different colors here are the different managers of giant sequoia groves. And so we work together as a coalition to try to accelerate the pace and scale of the work that we're doing. We're kind of centered around these different working groups. And so there's a steering committee, which I sit on. And then I'm also the co-chair of this ACT group, which is basically the folks that do the work on the ground, the burn bosses, foresters, and others. We have these major strategies. We also have a rally group that's focused about getting the word out on giant sequoias and what's happening with them. And then we have a learn group, which is all the scientists that are studying what we're doing and studying the impacts of what's happened over the last 10 years in helping us manage these forests. And so just in the last few years, this coalition's newer than the other one I was talking about. We've treated over 18,000 acres across the coalition. which is close to like 2/3 of all the acres of giant sequoias. So there's a little bit of double counting in this number because there are some areas that have been treated more than once, but we've treated more than half of all the acres of giant sequoias just in the last 4 years. And so kind of coming together as that coalition has really allowed that to happen. We've also been able to effectively respond to wildfires the last 2 years. So that fire that burned into that grove, McKinley Grove, we actually didn't see major losses of giant sequoias as a result of kind of some emergency work that happened right before the fire got there, and also just luck with rain. But the year before, we had another fire called the Coffee Pot Fire that would have been more destructive if it hadn't been for the coalition coming together. We're also working on trying to prioritize our work so that we can be more effective with fewer dollars. So, these are the blue groves here. This is that one that I was talking about, McKinley Grove. This was prioritized this past spring as the most vulnerable grove and has since burned, and we're really lucky that it didn't burn at a higher severity. We're also prioritizing places where we need to replant. And so when you have these crown fires that run through giant sequoias, you lose your seed source. And so in some cases, we have to go back in and replant. So we've planted over 600,000 trees over the last 4 years. And the other part of the work that we're doing in both ranges, but especially here in the giant sequoia range, is working with tribes and reintroducing cultural burning. So this was the first cultural burn that we held on, say, the Redwoods League property. And it's really a melding of cultural and of culture and the work on the ground. And we've now had 4 of them just in the last 2 years. And it's really about kind of bringing back that traditional ecological knowledge back into the work that we do. And one of the things about working in the Sierra Nevada, there's really only one tribe that has giant sequoias on their tribal reservation. There's probably like dozens of other tribes that are either landless or are confined to small 40-acre reservations. And so through this work that we're able to do, we're trying to bring some of those folks that don't have access to steward these groves back into the groves so that they can actually do that work again. There's a lot of challenges to the work that we do in trying to scale these kinds of things up. Some of these apply to the work in the Coast Redwood Range too. We have narrow treatment windows, and some of that is because the places that we work now are and the giant sequoias in particular, are really the only habitat left for some of our endangered species. And when you drive through the Southern Sierra, you can see why. There's literally hundreds of thousands of acres of burnt sticks. And then you get to these giant sequoia groves where a lot of those monarchs burned, but it's still in better shape than some of the other places. The work is extremely expensive. We all know that. And we're now in kind of a budget cycle where we're not getting federal funding for this kind of work. We don't get any revenue. We had a project that I like to cite in the giant sequoias where we actually did remove some saw logs to pay for the work, but we generated about $100,000 for a project that cost over $3 million. So that's kind of like the balance of how like biomass is not going to pay its way out of the woods. Contractor availability and expertise is a challenge. And then in the Coast Redwood Range, we're running into capacity issues with our mills. So just in the last 2 years, redwood prices have nosedived, and we're actually not even able to get buyers for all of our redwood, even though redwood is actually one of the most valuable lumber species. And then the transportation costs to get to a lesser mills. There's fewer mills, so the transportation costs go up. Capacity and priorities, that's become more of an issue in the last year, of course. Litigation is another issue. There are folks that don't think we should be doing this work and litigate our federal partners and slow things down. And then we have a kind of an expertise issue in prescribed burning that's proving to be a challenge as well as a risk tolerance. The Forest Service in particular has basically in the last year shifted to not doing prescribed fire. And so we're kind of back in this cycle now where we're concerned that we're going to be back to where we were on that earlier graph, suppressing fires again. So I know I'm kind of running short on time and I want to have time for questions, but what is restoration forestry? That's kind of the bucket of stuff that I do. Inherently restoration is the action of returning something to what it was before, right? So of course there's all sorts of fraught kind of externalities of that, right? What are we actually trying to restore to? A lot of what we're trying to do is restore conditions that existed prior to European colonization. And that's not just because that's the right thing to do. It's also because those forests were incredibly resilient. And the forests that Europeans saw when they first arrived were as a result of those practices that were being done for thousands of years. And we use a range of tools. We're using a lot of kind of the traditional tools to get this work done. So that includes silviculture, includes logging, includes thinning, prescribed burning, cultural burning, and other tools. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of not common. So there are folks out there that as soon as they see logging equipment, they think it's bad. And a lot of the work that we're trying to do is to kind of shift that narrative to there's good loggers, there's bad loggers, there's good environmentalists and bad environmentalists. Everything's gray, right? It's not black and white. And we need to think outside the box in the work that we do. So I'm just going to finish with kind of some major takeaways. With the work that we're doing, we're really trying to scale up. And you can't do that if you're practicing what I like to call boutique forestry, which is kind of smaller scale forestry. And a lot of the restoration forestry that happened over the first decade or two of that field was really more of this boutique forestry. And in order to scale that up, you have to use bigger tools. And that gets me to the next one. You can't create a problem created by bulldozers with a shovel. And so that's been something that agencies have had to struggle to learn as well, and particularly the Park Service. You can't fix these problems unless you bring some of that equipment back in to actually fix it. And then, kind of another one that I like to talk about with students is that, conservation isn't a mapping exercise. So you can't draw a circle around something in GIS or create a designation in Congress and then assume that it's protected. Stewardship it never ends. And it requires kind of a connection to the land that's enduring. And so the work that we do is trying to rebuild that connection and change that relationship between people and the land from a transactional one to a kind of a mutual relationship. And then big solutions require testing our biases and assumptions. If you had asked me 10 years ago whether I thought I would be commercially logging in Redwood National Park, I probably would have thought you were crazy. But we're doing that, and we actually have really broad community support for the work that we're doing. And so I think that I had a video that I was thinking I might show if I had time, but I want to make sure I have time for questions. So I'll send folks a link if they want to watch it. But yeah, maybe I'll stop and see if there's any questions. Oh, got the mic.
Thank you very much. This was great. Can you speak a little bit more to who, what individuals or what groups are litigating against this work and on what grounds? Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really small group of folks, I would say. But there's kind of a smaller, well, in some cases, Sierra Club isn't getting involved in these lawsuits. But there's kind of a smaller group of folks like they're called the John Muir Project that litigated the Park Service over replanting, for example, in giant sequoia groves, which seems like something that would be widely supported. They've litigated the Forest Service over a lot of the emergency work that they did. So one of the things that we as an organization did, we kind of have a policy group that was able to advocate for something called the Save Our Sequoias Act, which ironically now is potentially going to pass, which I'm really surprised about. But that bill was really intended to establish a congressionally designated emergency in the giant sequoia groves to say that work needed to happen at a faster pace. And that bill didn't pass, but it forced the Park Service and the Forest Service to declare their own emergencies, which was a good thing under the Biden administration. And so, but of course, these groups then sued over that. We haven't had any lawsuits on our Redwoods Rising work because we worked really hard, I would say, before the start of the project with our local environmental advocacy group and got them on board with the project. And so when these folks poke their head into the project and say, what is Save the Redwoods League doing here? What is Redwood National Park doing here? We have our local advocacy group kind of push back and say, don't worry about this, we've got it. So it's been a bigger issue, I would say, in the giant sequoias. But they've lost a lot of their cases. So there's now kind of more of a case law kind of around kind of just the fact that they're basically wasting judges' times. And some of the judges' reports that they write are like kind of scathing to these groups because it's really not founded in science. But sometimes they'll even go out and like do their own science, like creating variable radius seedling plots in places where it's like that's not even a. So anyways, there's some bias there. But anyways, next question.
We have time for one more.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit? So you talk about restoration as the attempt to restore it to a previous state,
Yeah.
but we live in a world that's not going to,
Right.
unfortunately, look like that or feel like that.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit about how you are designing restoration to make these forests more resilient to the likely conditions they'll encounter in the future?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, so of course that's the case, and it's particularly pressing in the giant sequoia range where we're seeing these major landscape scale changes and fire regimes completely shift too. And so we are thinking about it. We're prioritizing groves that we want to treat post-fire kind of based on, in some cases it's kind of triage work where we're, in some cases, sacrificing the ones that we think are more vulnerable in the future for the ones that we think have a higher likelihood of persistence. We've done some assisted migration, kind of like upslope in some places with giant sequoia as well, anticipating that their range may go up in elevation. In the coast redwood range, we haven't seen range contraction yet as a result of climate change, and there's a lot of uncertainty about that because the climate models there's not a lot of certainty around fog, which is the biggest thing that we're concerned about with coast redwoods. So in some cases, some models, it shows coastal fog will actually increase as a result of climate change because that temperature gradient between the coast and the Central Valley is really what pulls that fog in. And so other models are saying it's going to decrease. And you talk to old timers and they'll say it's less foggy than it used to be. But whether that's, it's kind of hard with the anecdotal evidence. But yeah, we are thinking about that. We had a high severity fire in the Coast Redwood Range in 2020 near where I live. And I was working on that fire where we saw running crown fires in Coast Redwood forests. We'd never really seen that before. And so that was kind of an eye-opening fire event. Not to say that it maybe hasn't ever happened in geologic time, but we're seeing things change. We know that, and we need to think about preparing these forests for that future fire regime, for those future conditions. But in some cases, it's kind of a practice of triage and trying to figure out where you're going to work and why. Because you could do a lot, but you only have so much money and so much capacity.
Okay, if you could join me in thanking Ben once again, there's a class coming in.
Thank you.